The thing with trauma is that it takes away your emotional safety. Your brain is a systemic organ, yeah. So you have your right hemisphere, left hemisphere. You bring that together, you have a neurological working system that feeds into the central nervous system, that feeds into all your other systems in your body. Emotional neglect, especially in early childhood, can lead to the brain rewiring itself. So think about a child or an individual who has to think about their future if the caregiver is not present. This young child's brain will become an adult who has numerous scenarios in their brain. If the brain of this child, not even if, because the brain of this child has had different scenarios, the base of their thinking is actually in a threatening way. Can you imagine learning in a war? It's like you're in a war, there's bombs left, right, center, everywhere, and then somebody's coming to teach you French. There's no way the brain is going to adapt to that French. Thank you, everybody, for joining me. My name is Nyambura Gadhumbe. I am a therapist, and I love what I do. And we've been talking about CPTSD, so that's complex post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm going to introduce just very briefly what that is, but then today I want us to talk about CPTSD and ADHD and how that can actually look like in your life and how that can affect you. So sit back, take notes, ask questions, criticize, but kindly. I'm very sensitive. Please, Akim, siniachie comments mbaya mbaya. Let's go. So as we mentioned, or rather as I introduced CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, this is in general an individual who's gone through extensive amounts of trauma. So they've been exposed to trauma. And so just once again, to understand what trauma is, this is a traumatic event. So something quite tragic happening to you. So we call that a traumatic event that leads to an emotional experience, right? Because the thing with trauma is that it takes away your emotional safety. So you have this traumatic event that's leading to an emotional experience. And with CPTSD, you're actually not looking at just one trauma. You're looking at many small traumas that an individual has been exposed to over a prolonged duration of time that has led to their brains rewiring and the brain having a worldview that everything before them is a threat. And as I mentioned earlier, CPTSD, we not only look at what happened to you, we look at what did not happen to you that should have happened to you, and how did your brain adapt to that, and how did your central nervous system adapt to that, and how are you continuing to adapt to that. So in short, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, as the name suggests, is a traumatic disorder that has been experienced by somebody who's experienced a lot of traumas. And one of the key things with CPTSD is actually emotional neglect, because emotional neglect, especially in early childhood, can lead to the brain rewiring itself. Not so fun fact, there was a research done by an institute, I forget the name, and they looked at the brain scans, one of a 3-year-old who's been emotionally cared for, and one of a 3-year-old who's been emotionally neglected. And the brain scan of the 3-year-old was much smaller than the one who's been emotionally cared for. So evidently, you can see that trauma, it's not just something that happens to you that is in the past. And especially if you've been through emotional neglect, that can actually lead to the brain protecting itself, developing much faster. And that might seem like a good thing, but ideally it's not, because ideally the brain learns to look at threat even when threat is not there. And so an individual who has CPTSD has high levels of cortisol in their body. Why? And by the way, unfortunately, CPTSD is not in our DSM. DSM is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. It's now been updated to DSM-6 or Diagnostic Statistical Manual 6. It's so unfortunate that CPTSD is still not recognized as an actual thing that people go through. So what we use to diagnose is something called ICD-11, which has a much bigger scope. And so in ICD-11, if you're looking at exploring if you do have CPTSD or not, so you're going to look for post-traumatic stress disorder chronic. So in the ICD-11, it's not even called complex, it's called chronic, which I think makes sense because it shows the level of chronic trauma that somebody has gone through. With all that long introduction, let's look at how CPTSD shows up in ADHD. And I know these are many alphabets, but I promise you they mean something. So ADHD is defined as attention deficiency hyper disorder. It's what that was formerly known as ADD, or attention deficiency disorder. It was originally thought as a neurodegenerative condition. It's something to do with the brain. It has a lot to do with the brain. We're coming to that shortly. But there are various debates now on, is it really a disorder or is it a brain adaptation mechanism from stress? How does that look like? So think about a child or an individual who has to think about their future if the caregiver is not present. So let's take a 10-year-old child. So this 10-year-old child, already they know that their parent is not present. I certainly don't sit in the seat of piety. I don't condemn parents because I don't know what parents went through. I do, however, highlight the humanity of parents because sometimes even in the caregiving and in the sacrifice that our parents take us through, they can injure us. So maybe this is a child whose parent is not there. We don't know why. And so this child, right from when they were much younger, has learned to predict his or her future by creating several scenarios. So this is a child who's created scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3, scenario 4. The need for these numerous scenarios is because this child knows that they're taking care of themselves. It's an unconscious thought. It's not something that they've decided. They've had to adapt based on their environment. And so this young child's brain will become an adult who has numerous scenarios in their brain. And in systemic therapy, we define ADHD as a flight of ideas. It's a flight of thoughts, actually, not ideas, a flight of thoughts. So you have your brain that has scenario 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I'm going to break this down very slowly so we understand. Now, your brain is a systemic thing. Your brain is a systemic organ, yeah. So you have your right hemisphere, left hemisphere. You bring that together. You have a neurological working system that feeds into the central nervous system, that feeds into all your other systems in your body. So imagine your brain that is an electrical organ. So fun fact, brain matter, 95% cholesterol. That's why kichwa ya supu slaps as it does. And God, in his wisdom and genius, knew that fat is a great neutralizer or conductor of electricity because your brain is electric. Now, nobody on this earth in 2026 can actually tell you where one neuron starts and where the other neuron ends. And that shows you how systemic the brain is. What that means is you can't say that neuron A is connected to neuron B and then neuron Z has an end. Ideally, you can't tell where one neuron starts and where one neuron ends because all neurons are interconnected. I hope you got that. So then imagine this 10-year-old literally has been overworking their brain. And the brain, when two neurons wire together, they fire together, right? So that means your brain is discharging energy. Now, how does that happen? So you got to think of the neurons of the brain like as a light switch. You know the way ukiwakisha stima, when you put on the lights, the fluorescent or the bulb, it gives you light, but it also gives you energy from the light. So you can't say, I just want the light, I don't want the energy. It just comes because it's an electrical thing. So then every time this child's brain is thinking, the body is receiving energy. And sometimes that's what we call emotions. Some people call it feelings. Some people call it energy, but scientifically that's energy. Now, if the brain of this child, because the brain of this child has had different scenarios, the base of their thinking is actually in a threatening way. What do I mean by that? The reason why they need scenario A, scenario B, scenario C is because just in case scenario A doesn't work, we have scenario B. Just in case scenario B doesn't work, we have scenario C. So that just in case is the threatening state that I'm talking about, that the brain has learned to live constantly in a threatening state. So if we want to go a little bit more scientific, there's a part of the brain there that's called the limbic system that has many parts. Amongst one of the parts that's responsible for safety or threat state of the brain is the amygdala, which is like a small almond thing there. Now, every time your amygdala is activated, some other regions of the brain, like the memory and the learning center of the brain, they have to sleep. Why? Can you imagine learning in a war? It's like you're in a war, there's bombs left, right, center, everywhere, and then somebody's coming to teach you French. There's no way the brain is going to adapt to that French. So when this amygdala is active, it communicates to other parts of the body, the thyroid, and also the endocrine system. The endocrine system is the hormonal system. It's saying release cortisol. So now you have somebody, because of how they were brought up, because of CPTSD, they are constantly high on cortisol. So how does that look like in ADHD? As I mentioned, ADHD means attention deficiency hyperdisorder. So with ADHD, we have 3 types for now. We have the inattention, which is the inability for somebody to pay attention. We have the hyperactivity, which is somebody, the sporadic, you're constantly on the go. And then we have combined. Now, because your body is constantly on cortisol, by the time an individual is thinking all these thoughts, they have solutions, and then they have solutions for the solutions in case the first solutions don't work. So I hope you can see how complex this is. And for me, I changed the names for inattention because let's start even by understanding the comorbidity. Comorbidity means 2 things happening together or 2 diseases coming together, and that's not uncommon. Let's start with inattention. So we'll look at ADHD inattention, ADHD hyperactivity, and then ADHD combined. So let's look at ADHD inattention and CPTSD. Remember, with CPTSD, the brain is already rewired into thinking of a threatening state. So think about it, this person has come to work. As they're driving to work, as they're going to work, as they're walking to work, the brain has ran through so many ideas and situations. So that this person, by the time they come to work, they are so tired, like they don't have energy because the brain has been overworking. They're given a task, it becomes impossible to do that task, or they start tasks here and there and they drop them. And sometimes guys who have inattention can be misunderstood as being lazy. They can be misunderstood as being nonchalant. They can also be misunderstood as not being caring. Really, the whole idea is they're not lazy. It's just that they have so many things in their brain, they don't even know which one to focus on. And then underlying it, there is fear that if I focus on one and it fails, and they're already feeling the emotional experience based on the traumatic event, that's too much for them. So what do people who have CPTSD that shows up as ADHD inattention do? They shut down. They have to, because their body is tired and their brain is like overthinking. So they will shut down. They will need numerous alone time just to recharge. This is how CPTSD sometimes can be, ADHD inattention sometimes can be mistaken as the primary diagnosis, but the primary diagnosis is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD, that's exhibiting itself as ADHD inattention. Now let's look at CPTSD and ADHD hyperactivity. So as the name suggests, hyperactivity is like these guys who are constantly on the go. When I was in corporate, I had this boss who constantly, when we're in meetings, or he would wake up and just walk around the room or pace. And for me, it always irritated me because I'm just like, can you just calm down? And that's one of the observation of ADHD hyperactivities, where you're constantly on the move. You can't sit. Like you're tapping, you're screaming, you're listless, like you need to go quickly. Now, I need to share this. When somebody has CPTSD, and sometimes the symptom is ADHD hyperactivity, The safety is in the movement. The emotional safety is in the movement. What do I mean? When you have CPTSD, you've learned how to detach from the emotional experience that's going on, because that's a behavior adaptation for safety. So when an individual who has CPTSD and the symptoms come out as ADHD hyperactivity, the fact that they are moving, then the need for them to constantly be on the move, the need for them to wake up, to walk, to talk, to have very stupendous emotional gestures. That movement for them feels like safety. Because with CPTSD, sitting quietly for some people means a threat. Because based on how somebody grew up, silence was always preceded by a traumatic event. Either you're at home, everything is quiet. The moment the caregiver comes in, or the sibling or whoever, there is shouting. So an individual who has CPTSD and the symptom might be ADHD hyperactivity, that movement is actually what keeps them safe. They feel like as long as I'm moving, I'm safe because nobody is coming to harm me. Now, let's look at CPTSD and ADHD combined. This is where there are symptoms of inattention, and this is where there are symptoms of hyperactivity, where they are both combined. Of course, it makes sense because sometimes if the CPTSD is flaring up based on what they're going through, there are moments, there are days they want to just be quiet. And then there are days that they have energy to do a lot of projects. So you'll find like there's a curve of up and down, like the productivity is going up and down. Now, I want to I want to be astute on this disclaimer. I'm not refuting that ADHD exists. It does. I'm just asking therapists, maybe psychiatrists, I don't have the authority for that because I'm not a psychiatrist, but maybe psychiatrist is to evaluate, is this really ADHD? Or is the root of the ADHD CPTSD? Because since 2020, there's been a flare-up of adult ADHD. But if you dig deeper and if you understand ADHD, you realize it's a behavior adaptation of something. I'm not refuting it is actually a mental disorder. I'm just saying maybe sometimes we are treating symptoms instead of looking at the root cause of it. So that's it for the science lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, comments, and if you want to be on this podcast and you want to be asked questions, please reach out on the number below. I think this is where below is. And we'll see if you fit the profile. And yeah, thank you for listening and have a ADHD-free day.